Everyone remembers Animals as the album where Roger Waters took control of Pink Floyd. That much is true, and it is also the least interesting thing about it. The takeover gets repeated in every documentary. The concept hardening, the four-man democracy collapsing into one man's vision. What almost no one ever names is the price of that takeover, or the man who paid it, because a takeover requires something to be taken. And on Animals, what was taken had a name, and a sound, and a function in the music so deep that removing it changed what Pink Floyd was. For 10 years, on every record the band made, one musician supplied the chords that let the music breathe. On Animals, in 1977, his name disappears from the writing credits for the first time in the band's history. He is still in the room. He's still playing, but something has gone quiet that will never fully return. And 2 years before the band formally cast him out, you can hear the exact moment the air begins to leave the building. His name was Richard Wright. And the reason you have to be told what he did is that what he did was the hardest thing in music to point at. Guitar solos announce themselves. A bass player who writes the words and runs the concept announces himself. Wright did neither. Wright supplied the atmosphere. And atmosphere is invisible when it works, because you do not notice it. You simply find yourself somewhere. He wrote the chords underneath, the suspended harmonies that refuse to resolve, the slow analog washes of organ and electric piano that behave less like an instrument than like weather. He was the air inside the building. Gilmour built the walls and Waters drew the blueprint, but Wright was the thing you breathed once you were inside. He was the reason the music had a temperature. You can measure exactly what that was worth by listening to where it peaked. On the dark side of the moon, the descending drift of Breathe is his, the sound of falling without fear. The terrifying climb of the great gig in the sky is built on his progression, his sense that a chord can be a kind of grief. Us and Them, maybe the most beautiful thing the band ever recorded, began as a Wright composition, an organ meditation he had written years earlier, and its whole devastating patience comes from him. 2 years later, on Wish You Were Here, the case is even clearer. The long elegy for the lost Syd Barrett opens with 4 notes on a synthesizer that have become some of the most recognized in the history of the form. And those 4 notes and the vast, aching space around them are Wright. The emotional heart of the album that mourns the band's founder was written, in large part, by the quietest man in the band. As late as 1975, this is who Wright was, an author, the supplier of the ache. Now set that against the cold fact of the credits on Animals, because the fact is brutal and it is not opinion. The album has 5 pieces. Pigs on the Wing, both parts, Waters alone. Pigs, 3 different ones, Waters alone. Sheep, Waters alone. Dogs, the 17-minute epic at the center, Waters and Gilmour. Run the list and do the arithmetic the documentaries skip. Wright's name is on none of it. Not a co-credit, not a fragment. For the first time in the band's history, the man who wrote the chords that let Pink Floyd breathe is, on paper, the author of nothing. The man who gave you the descent of Breathe and the climb of Great Gig and the elegy at the center of Wish You Were Here is, on the very next record, credited with not 1 note. That is not an evolution. That is a silence with a date on it. The truth behind the silence is not a villain's story, and it is sadder than one. The mid-1970s were the years of Wright's personal collapse. His first marriage was failing. He had fallen into the fog of cocaine and withdrawal and depression that would shadow the rest of the decade. and in that fog he simply stopped bringing material to the band. The well that produced Breathe and Us and Them went quiet. Not because anyone forbade it, but because the man producing it was coming apart. And a vacuum in a band does not stay empty. When Wright stopped supplying, somebody had to. And the somebody was Waters, who had both the material and, increasingly, the appetite for total authorship. So the takeover was partly an occupation of empty ground. Wright vacated the harmonic center, and Waters moved in. What looks from outside like a coup looks from inside like one man's silence being filled by another man's certainty. The tragedy is that both are true at once. So where do you actually hear the disappearance? This is what separates a thesis from a feeling, and the answer is precise. Listen to the opening of Sheep. Before the bass enters, before the menace, before the track turns into a machine, there is a passage of Fender Rhodes electric piano, floating, warm, harmonically open, and it is right. It is the old air, the last clear breath of the Pink Floyd that breathed. And then, listen to what happens. The bass arrives, the rhythm hardens, the synthesizers turn from weather into weaponry, and the warmth is not developed. It is consumed. That Rhodes intro is the most poignant moment on the album precisely because of where it sits. A fragment of the old soul placed at the threshold of a track that spends the next 10 minutes burying it. The building breathes once at the start of Sheep, and then the air is pulled out of the room. The whole album obeys that logic. A Pink Floyd record is, among other things, a question of who gets the long instrumental stretches, because that is where the soul of the band is decided. On Dark Side and Wish You Were Here, that space was shared, and the keyboard was often the lead voice. On Animals, it belongs almost entirely to Gilmour's guitar. Dogs, for all its brilliance, is a guitar epic. 17 minutes built around Gilmour as soloist and Waters as architect, while Wright's keyboards do the work of texture and support, the cold sustained pads, the functional rather than the authorial. And this is the distinction that protects the whole argument. Wright is not absent from Animals. He plays throughout, but there is an enormous difference between playing and authoring, between supplying texture and supplying the chords that decide what the music means, and on Animals, Wright is demoted from the second to the first. He becomes a color in someone else's painting. The man who wrote the emotional center of the previous two albums is reduced on this one to atmosphere applied over a structure he did not design. And that structure has a temperature, and the temperature is the evidence you need no liner notes to perceive. Animals is cold. It is harsh, angular, propulsive, biting, brilliant in exactly those qualities. And it has lost something the earlier records had in abundance: the harmonic tenderness, the suspended ache, the sense of floating in warm, unresolved space. The melancholy spaciousness that defined Pink Floyd from Metal onward is replaced by Waters' acid, by the hard architecture of a man with a thesis and very little interest in letting a chord simply hang and breathe. This does not make Animals a lesser record. It makes the hardness a symptom. The coldness of Animals is the audible shape of Wright's silencing, because the warmth was his. And when the author of the warmth stops authoring, the music gets cold. The surface of the album is the autopsy report. I owe you the strongest objection because a thesis that cannot survive it is worthless. The objection says Wright still plays substantially on the record, including that very Rhodes intro, so calling it his erasure is melodrama. It says the coldness is intentional, that a record about a society sorted into predators and prey should sound hard. And in its deepest form, it says right is not even the only one diminished. Because Gilmore, too, is subordinated, and what Animals really documents is Waters becoming the band, everyone else reduced to executors of his vision. All of that is true, and it does not dissolve the thesis, it sharpens it. Yes, the consolidation is Waters over everyone, but there is a difference of degree so large it becomes a difference of kind, and the difference is the credits. Gilmore still co-writes Dogs, still owns the guitar, still gets the 17 minutes, still has a domain. Wright gets nothing. Of the 3 men diminished by Waters' rise, 2 keep a territory and 1 is reduced to 0. Wright is not merely the most diminished. He is the only one fully erased. That is why Animals is, correctly, the Wright album. The document of his vanishing, even though his fingerprints are on every track. He plays all over the record that proves he no longer matters to it. And the date becomes a sentence. If Animals in 1977 is the first silence, then The Wall in 1979 is the execution. By those sessions, Waters' control was absolute, and the occupation of empty ground ended in expulsion. Wright was forced out of Pink Floyd. He played the resulting tour, but not as a member. He played it as a salaried employee on the stage that carried his own band's name, and history kept one last bitter joke for him. The Wall tour, with its monstrous costs, lost money, and Wright, on a flat fee rather than a share of the losses, was the only member of Pink Floyd to come out of it ahead. The man erased as an author and demoted to an employee was, by the cold logic of the contract, the only one who profited from his own humiliation. There is no consolation in that. There is only the precision of it, the way it completes the shape Animals began. 1977 is where his voice goes silent. 1979 is where his name comes off the door. I do not want to leave you with a morality play, Waters the tyrant and Wright the saint, because that is not what the music says. Waters' takeover produced extraordinary work, and Animals itself is a savage, coherent, fully realized record that no one else could have made. But achievement and cost are not opposites. And the point of listening seriously rather than nostalgically is to hold both at once. What Animals achieves, it achieves by subtraction. And the thing subtracted was the harmonic soul of the band, the suspended warmth that made Pink Floyd float rather than merely march. You can admire the march, I do. But I cannot hear the Rhodes intro of Sheep without hearing it for what it is, a last exhalation before the windows are sealed. After Animals, Pink Floyd would make grander and more famous records. But it would never again make one that breathed quite the way the records with Wright at their harmonic center breathed. Because the man who supplied the breath had been, first quietly and then officially, removed from the room. If you want to follow this thread all the way through the catalog, the full argument, album by album, with Wright restored to the center of the story where he belongs, is the spine of my Pink Floyd dossier, and the link is waiting for you in the pinned comment. The standard story tells you Animals is where Roger Waters took Pink Floyd. The truer story tells you Animals is where Pink Floyd stopped being a place you could breathe inside. And the difference between those two stories is one man's name, missing from the credits for the first time in 10 years, while his hands keep playing the music that no longer belongs to him. So I will leave you the question the documentaries never ask. When a band loses the man who gave it air and keeps his hands but erases his name, has it won anything at all? Where art does not console, it autopsies.